But in that moment, none of that mattered. He wasn't a federal agent anymore. He wasn't undercover. He was just a black man being questioned by a cop who saw him through the lens of racial bias, not as someone who had devoted his life to serving his country. The cop's actions were fueled by something deeper than just a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't just about the stop. It was about what he saw in the agent's face, what he assumed about him because of the color of his skin. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with. He didn't know that the man standing before him had served in multiple high-risk operations, had cracked cases that most people would never even imagine, or that his role as an undercover agent meant his life was constantly on the line. But none of that mattered to the officer. In his eyes, the agent wasn't a man serving his country. He was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The agent's mind flicked back to his training, remembering the countless lessons on how to de-escalate tense situations. But this wasn't like the scenarios he had been trained for. This was different. He wasn't facing a criminal, someone who was trying to harm him. He was facing a system that, in that moment, didn't seem interested in seeing him as a human being first. As the officer continued to bark orders, the agent remained calm. He knew that showing fear, even the slightest hint of panic, would make things worse. So, he took a deep breath, keeping his hands visible, trying to reason with the officer. "I'm with the FBI," he said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "I'm an undercover agent. You can check my ID." But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, the officer's hand hovered near his gun, and the tension in the air grew heavier by the second. The agent could see the officer's eyes narrowing, his posture rigid, as if the mere fact that the agent was black and standing before him was enough to trigger suspicion. The agent knew better than to make any sudden moves. He didn't want to provoke the officer into anything rash. But as the situation dragged on, it became clear that the officer wasn't going to take him at his word. The agent's thoughts were interrupted when the officer shouted for backup. The agent couldn't help but feel a chill run through him. Backup? For a simple traffic stop? He couldn't understand why this was happening. There was no reason for things to escalate this way. He was an officer of the law, just as the cop was. He was on the same side. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The officer's actions were telling a different story. The situation was rapidly slipping out of control, and the agent feared that things were about to get far worse before they could get better. In the distance, he could hear the sirens of the backup approaching. It was a sound he knew all too well, one that typically signaled the arrival of support in an emergency situation. But this time, it felt different. The backup was coming to reinforce the officer who had already decided that he was a threat, without knowing a single thing about him. The agent could feel the sting of injustice deep in his chest. He wasn't just facing a misunderstanding, he was facing something much darker. This wasn't just about a single officer's actions. This was about the deep-seated prejudices that many law enforcement officers held, the ones that led them to see people who looked like him as a threat before they even had a chance to speak. The backup arrived, and the tension grew even more palpable. More officers emerged from their vehicles, their eyes scanning the scene. Some of them seemed to hesitate, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but others were more aggressive, their hands resting on their weapons, as if prepared for a confrontation. The agent felt his heart race even faster. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his composure. But he knew one thing for sure. If he lost his cool now, things would spiral completely out of control. The officer who had initially pulled him over wasn't backing down. He barked more orders, demanding that the agent step out of the vehicle. The agent complied, slowly and carefully, making sure his movements were deliberate, controlled. He could hear the officers muttering among themselves, but the words were a blur. He had no idea if they were on his side or not. All he could focus on was the officer in front of him, who had now called for a full search. The agent's mind raced as the officers moved closer, their hands hovering over their holsters. His training kicked in again, urging him to stay calm, to try to reason with them. But there was no reasoning with someone who was determined to see him as the enemy, someone who was more interested in maintaining control than in doing what was right. As the officers began to search his vehicle, the agent couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. This wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity, it felt like an all-out assault on his dignity. He could feel the weight of their judgment on him, heavy and oppressive. It wasn't just about this stop anymore. It was about everything that had led to this moment, everything that had built up over the years, the biases and the assumptions that made this officer see him as less than human. The backup officers were still surrounding him, their eyes scanning every move, every shift in his posture. The agent felt the spotlight on him, as if he were under a magnifying glass. And with each passing second, he could feel the walls closing in. What would happen next? Would the truth finally come out? Or would he continue to be caught in a system that refused to see him for who he truly was? The questions burned in his mind as the tension in the air thickened. Everything was hanging by a thread. And the clock was ticking. The agent stood there, his body tense, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The world around him felt like it had slowed down, each passing moment stretching out into eternity. He could hear the murmurs of the officers as they moved around him, but it all seemed muffled, like he was trapped in a bubble of disbelief. They were all looking at him, judging him, and with each passing second, the weight of the situation grew heavier. The officer who had pulled him over had a look on his face that the agent couldn't quite place. It wasn't just suspicion. It was something deeper, something personal. This officer had already made up his mind about him, and nothing the agent could say would change it. The more the agent tried to explain, the more the officer's anger seemed to swell, as though the very idea of being questioned by someone who didn't belong in the situation was a challenge to his authority. "Step away from the car," the officer barked again, his voice thick with impatience. The agent complied, taking slow, deliberate steps backward. Every move felt calculated, as though any wrong gesture would lead to disaster. His mind flashed through every piece of training he had ever received, everything from crisis negotiation to diffusing hostile situations, but none of that seemed to matter now. This was different. This wasn't about dealing with criminals or trying to talk someone out of a bad decision. This was about something deeper, something systemic, and it made every breath feel heavier. As the agent stepped away from the vehicle, the officer began rifling through his things, tossing aside documents and equipment with little care. The agent could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, some of them skeptical, some of them cold, as if they, too, had already decided who he was. The more they dug through his car, the more the agent could feel his sense of injustice building inside of him. Was this what it felt like to be invisible in the system? To be seen not for what you were, but for what others assumed you to be. For a brief moment, the agent locked eyes with one of the backup officers, a younger man who appeared hesitant, unsure. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, regret, perhaps, or confusion. But before the agent could try to communicate anything, the officer quickly looked away. It was a small, fleeting moment, but it spoke volumes. The agent realized that some of these officers might not even be fully aware of what they were participating in. But that didn't change the reality of the situation. This wasn't just about the one officer who had pulled him over. This was a reflection of a broken system that had allowed racial profiling and bias to fester for far too long. The agent shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay as calm as possible. He had dealt with threats from all kinds of dangerous people, but this felt different. There was no immediate physical danger, no criminal to chase, but there was something more insidious at play here, something that cut deeper than a physical confrontation ever could. The backup officers were now starting to circle around him. One by one, they took positions, but none of them seemed to be offering anything that resembled support. They weren't speaking up, weren't questioning the validity of the officer's actions. Instead, they stood silently, either too scared to intervene or, worse, too willing to let the situation unfold as it was. The agent knew that if he didn't find a way to de-escalate things soon, it was only a matter of time before the situation became even more volatile. He could hear the muffled sound of sirens in the distance, the echoes of a system that was about to move in full force. But this wasn't just any backup. This wasn't a routine call for assistance. It felt like an invitation for more trouble, a sign that the system was closing in on him, not to protect, but to reinforce the idea that he was, somehow, a threat. In the back of his mind, he could feel his FBI training urging him to hold on, to stay patient. He knew that he had a way out, that eventually the truth would come to light. But in this moment, he couldn't escape the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. He could already hear the whispers in his head, the ones that said, "You don't belong here. This is who they think you are." A part of him wanted to scream. Another part wanted to lash out, to demand justice, to make them all understand that he wasn't just some random black man. But he knew that wasn't the way forward. He had been trained to think strategically, to stay composed no matter the circumstances. But in the pit of his stomach, there was a sinking feeling that this was going to be a lot harder than he'd ever imagined. Finally, the officer who had started it all, still seething with contempt, approached him again. His hand remained on his weapon, his fingers twitching with the tension of a man who felt cornered. "You're under arrest," the officer said, his voice low and firm. The agent's heart dropped. He wasn't sure whether it was the sudden shift in the officer's tone, or the realization that this moment was happening for real, but it was clear that the situation was about to get even worse. The officer wasn't interested in hearing anything else. No more explanations, no more attempts at reason. This wasn't about the law anymore, it was about something else entirely. "On what grounds?" the agent asked, his voice calm but thick with disbelief. He couldn't understand how things had escalated so quickly, how the mere act of being black had led to his arrest, with no regard for the truth, for his identity, or for the evidence that could clear his name. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed the agent's arms, roughly twisting them behind his back and snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. The agent winced, the cold metal biting into his skin, but he didn't resist. Not yet. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this one felt different. It wasn't the physical threat that he feared, it was the weight of what this meant for his career, his reputation, and his very existence in a system that wasn't built to protect him. As the officer pulled him toward the squad car, the agent caught sight of the other officers, some still watching, others already turning away. No one stepped in. No one tried to stop this injustice from unfolding. And in that moment, the agent realized just how deep the problem ran. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that allowed this kind of thing to happen time and time again. With every step toward the squad car, the agent felt the crushing weight of the situation grow heavier. How would he get out of this? How would he prove who he was? And more importantly, how long would it take before the truth finally broke through? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain. This was just the beginning of a fight for justice that was about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The question was, would anyone stand up for what was right? The agent was shoved into the back of the squad car, the cold metal of the door slamming shut behind him. As the officer climbed into the driver's seat, the agent couldn't help but feel the weight of the handcuffs digging into his wrists, each shift in position making the pain sharper. He sat there in the back, staring out the window, the city passing by like a blur. It felt surreal, almost like he was watching someone else's life unfold. But it wasn't someone else's life, it was his. He knew he had to stay calm. He couldn't let his emotions get the best of him now. He had been through worse before. He had been in far more dangerous situations where his life had been on the line. But this was different. It wasn't just a physical threat, it was something deeper, more insidious. This wasn't just a man trying to harm him. This was an entire system that had failed him, that had made assumptions about who he was before even bothering to listen. The tension inside the car was suffocating, the silence between him and the officer thick with resentment. He had tried to explain who he was, but it was clear the officer wasn't listening. In his mind, the agent wasn't an FBI agent. He wasn't a man trying to make the world a better place. He was a black man who had crossed a line that no badge or law could erase. The officer's grip on the wheel tightened as if trying to force some kind of control over a situation he didn't understand, a situation he didn't want to understand. The agent knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every black person who had been wrongly accused, every black person who had been treated as less than human by those who were supposed to protect them. He could feel the weight of centuries of injustice pressing down on his chest. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom now, he was fighting for something much bigger. Back at the scene of the arrest, the other officers were still milling around. Some were talking, others were looking at the ground, unsure of what to do. They were all trained to uphold the law, but in this moment, none of them seemed to know what the right thing was. The younger officer, the one who had looked hesitant earlier, was standing off to the side, his face conflicted. He had seen something that didn't sit right with him, but he wasn't sure how to voice it. How could he? Who would listen? In a world where the badge was everything, where questioning authority often meant questioning your own place in the system, how could he speak out? His mind raced as he watched the squad car pull away. He knew something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what to do about it. He had never been in a situation like this before, never had to confront his own biases or the harsh reality of how his colleagues treated people of color. He had joined the force because he wanted to make a difference, but now, standing in the aftermath of the arrest, he wasn't sure if that difference was even possible. Meanwhile, in the back of the squad car, the agent's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. How could this have happened? How had he ended up in a situation where his identity was being ignored, where the color of his skin had determined his fate? He thought back to his training, to everything he had learned about resilience and self-control. But none of that seemed to matter now. There was no amount of training that could prepare you for the feeling of being dehumanized in real time, of being treated like an object rather than a person. He could hear the sound of his own breath in the car, each inhale a reminder that he had to keep it together. He had to stay focused. But it wasn't just about getting out of this situation. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. The longer he sat there, the more he realized how important it was to push back, to demand accountability, not just for himself but for the countless others who had faced the same treatment. The squad car made its way to the precinct, the agent's thoughts growing darker with every mile. He had always believed in the system, in the idea that justice would eventually prevail. But now, he wasn't so sure. He could feel the uncertainty in his gut, a gnawing fear that no matter what happened next, the system was already stacked against him. Inside the precinct, the tension was palpable. The officer who had arrested the agent walked in, his face flushed with anger, a mix of defiance and fear in his eyes. He had just made an arrest, but there was something unsettled about the way he carried himself. It wasn't the proud, confident posture of a man who believed he had done the right thing. No, this was the stance of someone who had doubts, someone who was trying to convince himself that he had done what he needed to do. The younger officer, who had been on the scene, watched from the corner of the room. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The agent, who had been nothing but calm, nothing but patient, was now behind bars. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was more than just a feeling, it was an undeniable truth gnawing at him. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about the system, about everything that had led to this moment. He had been part of it, complicit in it, and now, he wasn't sure how to step away. But he couldn't stand there forever, could he? The lines were already drawn. He had a choice to make. Speak out and risk his career, or stay silent and live with the guilt of knowing that he had done nothing to stop an injustice. It was a question that hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable, as the rest of the officers continued with their business. Back at the holding cells, the agent sat in silence, his mind spinning. He had been here before, in moments of crisis, but this time it felt different. There was no real reason for him to be locked up. No real reason for him to be treated like a criminal. And yet here he was, a man caught in the crosshairs of a system that didn't seem to care about the truth, only about the assumptions that it had already made. He couldn't help but think about the larger picture. This wasn't just his fight. This wasn't just about one bad cop, one misunderstanding. This was about a society that had turned its back on the very people it was supposed to protect. And now, he was paying the price. But he wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. The stakes were too high, and the truth was too important. As the hours stretched on, he sat quietly, his mind working through every possible scenario, every possible way to make this right. There had to be a way to expose the injustice. There had to be a way to make them see him for who he really was. But in that holding cell, with nothing but his thoughts for company, one question kept echoing in his mind. How far would he have to go to make them listen? The hours passed slowly, each one blending into the next as the agent sat in the holding cell. The hum of fluorescent lights above was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. His mind raced, analyzing every detail of the situation, but each thought seemed to lead to the same dead end. How had it come to this? How had a routine stop turned into an arrest that felt more like a personal vendetta than a matter of law? He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. The tightness in his chest was becoming unbearable, but he knew panicking wouldn't help. He had been in worse situations before, had survived encounters with dangerous criminals, faced down armed threats, and emerged unscathed. But this felt like a battle that was out of his control. There was no weapon to disarm, no enemy to confront head-on. This was a fight for his very identity, and the rules of the game were being rewritten before his eyes. Outside the cell, the precinct was alive with activity. Officers moved in and out, their conversations muffled, their footsteps quick. But the agent couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and he wasn't sure why. Was it because the officers knew the truth, but were too scared to face it? Or was there something more at play here, a bigger system of protection and complicity that he couldn't yet see? His thoughts were interrupted when a door slammed open, and the young officer from earlier walked into the holding area. His face was grim, eyes darting nervously around the room as if he was making sure no one was watching. The agent's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. This officer, the one who had shown hesitation earlier, had the power to make a difference. But would he? The young officer stepped closer to the cell, his voice low but urgent. "I know this doesn't make sense," he said, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was nearby. "I don't know what's going on, but I've got a bad feeling about all this. I need to talk to you. It's about the arrest." The agent's eyes narrowed, trying to gauge the officer's sincerity. Was this some kind of trick? Was he just trying to cover his own tracks? Or, for the first time, was someone actually willing to listen? "I'm listening," the agent replied quietly, his voice steady despite the rising storm of emotions inside him. The officer glanced around again before lowering his voice even further. "I was there. I saw it. Something's off. The way he treated you. It wasn't right. And now I'm hearing things. Rumors. About the department. About how things are handled. About how people like you are targeted. I'm just not sure what to believe anymore." The agent held his breath. This was it. The moment when the pieces could either start to fall into place or shatter completely. He had heard stories of corruption, of officers who had been forced to turn a blind eye to what they knew was wrong. But to have someone on the inside speak up, even in the smallest way, felt like a lifeline. "I don't know how much I can do," the officer continued, his hands shaking slightly. "But I can't just walk away from this. I can't keep pretending that everything is normal. I have to do something." The agent leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You need to start by making sure this gets seen. By making sure what's happening here doesn't stay buried. I don't care what you have to do. Just get the truth out." The officer nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll do what I can. But you need to be careful. There are people in this precinct, people in this city, who won't hesitate to make sure you never get a chance to speak your truth. If you try to fight this on your own, it might be the last thing you ever do." The agent met the officer's gaze, sensing the weight of his words. This was more than just an arrest now. This was about survival, his, and maybe even the officer's. The officer gave a curt nod before turning and walking away, disappearing back into the bustling precinct. The agent sat back against the cold wall of the holding cell, his mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. He had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in hours, he felt a spark of hope. There were cracks in the system, cracks that might be wide enough for the truth to slip through. But how far would he have to go to break it open? Outside, the city continued to move on, unaware of the drama unfolding just beneath the surface. The agent's arrest was only one of many stories, but it was a story that had the potential to spark a much larger conversation, if it could be told. The question was, who would be willing to listen? The minutes stretched into hours, and as night began to fall, the agent felt the weight of his situation settle deeper into his bones. He didn't know how much longer he could stay in this holding cell. He didn't know how long the rumors about his arrest would swirl around the precinct, but one thing was certain. The longer he stayed quiet, the more this story would fade into obscurity. The truth would be buried, and the system would remain intact, protecting those who had orchestrated this injustice. But he wasn't willing to let that happen. No matter what it took, he was determined to make sure this moment didn't slip through the cracks. He had a job to do, and no matter how high the stakes got, he would finish it. Because if he didn't, no one else would. As the night deepened, the agent's resolve hardened. He was ready to face whatever came next. He just hoped that when the time came, there would be someone, anyone, who was ready to stand with him. As the hours dragged on, the agent remained locked in the holding cell, a cold metal barrier between him and the outside world. He couldn't escape the feeling of time slipping away, as though every passing second was another one lost in the fight for his freedom. He thought about the officer who had come to him, the young officer who had expressed doubts, who had shown a glimmer of conscience in a world where most would have stayed silent. But even that small act of courage felt like it was being swallowed up by the weight of everything around him. Outside the cell, the precinct buzzed with activity, but it felt distant. The agents, the detectives, and the officers who moved through the hallways seemed like they were all caught up in a rhythm that didn't involve him. They spoke in low tones, their faces tight with tension, but none of them seemed to acknowledge the storm brewing just beneath the surface. And maybe they weren't supposed to. After all, that was how the system worked, wasn't it? Things stayed hidden, brushed under the rug, swept away before they had a chance to be seen. But the agent had been trained to see beyond the surface. He knew how to read between the lines. He could feel the eyes on him, the eyes that were starting to turn, the whispers that were beginning to circulate. This was no longer just about an arrest gone wrong. This was a fight for his very place in a system that was designed to overlook him, to push him aside. And yet, something was shifting. He could sense it. There was a moment coming, something pivotal, and whether he was ready or not, it was about to change everything. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening again. This time, it wasn't the young officer. This time, it was someone else. Someone higher up. The air in the room thickened as a man in a suit stepped into view. His face was expressionless, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't need to say anything. The agent recognized the look in his eyes immediately. It was the same look he had seen countless times before. Someone who believed they were in control of the situation. Someone who didn't believe in the concept of justice, but in power. The man didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're being transferred," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You're going to be moved to a different facility. There's nothing here for you anymore." The agent stood up, his mind working quickly, piecing things together. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. He didn't have the luxury of time, of waiting for someone else to intervene. He needed to act now. The man in front of him was a part of the system that had already made its decision, but the agent wasn't ready to be swept away. He had a role to play, a fight to finish, and if this was the last chance he had, he wasn't going to waste it. "I'm not going anywhere," the agent said, his voice calm but steady, full of defiance. "Not until I know the truth is out." The man raised an eyebrow, as though the agent's words were insignificant. "You don't have a choice. You've been arrested. You're a criminal now." The agent's chest tightened. Every word the man spoke felt like a punch to the gut, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. "You can't hide the truth. Not this time." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the agent could see something flicker in his gaze. Something close to frustration, maybe even fear. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. The man straightened, his voice becoming colder. "You don't understand the situation. You think this is about justice? About the law? No. This is about control. And you're a pawn in a much bigger game." The agent's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. A bigger game? What was the man talking about? Who else was involved? The man didn't answer his unspoken question. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the agent alone with his thoughts. The tension in the cell was almost suffocating now. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of the words that had just been exchanged. The agent knew something was wrong, deeply wrong. This wasn't just about him anymore. There were bigger forces at play, forces that were willing to do anything to make sure the truth stayed buried. He didn't know how deep this ran, but it was becoming clear that the fight he had thought was just about an arrest had turned into something far more dangerous. And if he didn't move quickly, it would be too late to change anything. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching again, but this time, it wasn't a figure in a suit or a hardened officer. It was the young officer. He was alone, his face filled with urgency. "They're going to move you," the officer said quickly, glancing around nervously. "I don't know how much time you have, but you need to leave, now. There are people here who, they're not going to stop until you're gone. They don't want anyone asking questions. Not anymore." The agent's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was the moment when everything would either fall into place or collapse into chaos. He had only moments to decide what to do. This wasn't just about escaping the immediate threat of being moved. This was about finding out who was behind all of this, who was orchestrating the cover-up, and how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. "You had to get me out of here," the agent said, his voice a mix of determination and urgency. "I need to find out who's pulling the strings. Who's behind this?" The officer hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "I don't know if I can help you. If they find out, they will," the agent cut him off. "But you have a choice. Right now, you can either walk away and let this happen, or you can stand up for what's right." Help me, and we might be able to expose everything." The officer swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between the agent and the door. The weight of the decision was evident in his eyes, and for a moment, the agent wondered if he would walk away. But then, slowly, the officer stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Follow me," he said, and without another word, he turned and led the agent through the back corridors of the precinct, toward a future that was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, a future that was full of possibility. The tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The agent didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just about clearing his name. This was about exposing a web of corruption, of lies, and of power that stretched farther than he could have ever imagined. And as the agent moved deeper into the precinct, he knew that everything was about to come to a head. The stakes had never been higher. The officer led the agent through the darkened hallways of the precinct, moving quickly but cautiously. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The agent's heart raced, but he kept his pace steady. He couldn't afford to make a sound, not now. There was no going back, no second chances. He had to trust the officer, his only ally in a sea of corruption, but the tension between them was palpable. Both of them were stepping into unknown territory, walking a line that could break at any moment. The officer glanced back over his shoulder, his expression filled with worry. "You're sure you're ready for this?" he asked in a hushed voice. "I don't know what they'll do if they catch wind of this. You're not just fighting for your freedom anymore. They'll do anything to cover this up." The agent nodded, his face set in a grim determination. "I didn't get this far to back down now. If we don't do something, everything I've been through, everything everyone's been through, will stay buried. It's not just about me. It's about exposing what's happening to everyone else." The officer's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he didn't say anything. He simply nodded and pushed open a door at the far end of the hallway. They were in the back rooms now. Rooms where the public didn't have access. Rooms where things were kept out of sight. The agent's pulse quickened. He could sense that they were getting close to something crucial. They were getting closer to the heart of the storm. Inside the room, the officer gestured for the agent to sit at a cluttered desk. Papers were scattered across the surface, and the hum of an old computer filled the space with a quiet buzz. The officer quickly pulled up a chair and sat across from him, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "We don't have much time," the officer whispered, leaning forward. "I got into some files. There's a pattern, something bigger than just this arrest. I don't know how deep this goes, but I'm telling you, the corruption is bigger than anyone realizes. The department's been covering for people, protecting certain individuals, silencing the ones who speak up." The agent leaned in closer, his mind racing as he processed the officer's words. "Who are they protecting?" he asked, his voice low. The officer hesitated, looking around as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. "I think it's someone higher up," he said quietly. "Someone with power, who knows how to manipulate the system. It's not just about the precinct, it's about the people pulling the strings from above. And if we can't figure out who they are, it's over. They'll bury this for good." The agent's mind swirled. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a web, a network of corruption and deceit that reached far beyond anything he had imagined. He had been right all along. This was bigger than one bad cop. But who was behind it all? Who was pulling the strings, orchestrating everything from the shadows? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The officer froze, his eyes wide with panic. The agent's heart skipped a beat. Was it too late? Had someone discovered what they were doing? The officer quickly stood and approached the door, opening it just a crack. The agent could barely make out the voices outside, but he could tell one of them was familiar. The voice of the man in the suit, the one who had told him he was being transferred. His gut clenched. This was the man who had dismissed him, who had shut down any hope of justice from the very beginning. The officer's voice was low but urgent. "I need to go over some paperwork. I'll be right back," he said, trying to sound calm, but the agent could hear the tension in his voice. There was a brief pause, then the man in the suit's voice replied, colder than ever. "You're wasting time. Get him moved. Now." The officer's face turned pale as he quickly shut the door, turning to face the agent with wide eyes. "They know," he said, barely able to contain his panic. "They're onto us. They're going to make sure you disappear before anyone knows the truth. We don't have much time." The agent's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the moment settling in, the pressure building around him. This was it. There was no turning back. The stakes had never been higher. If they didn't act now, if they didn't find a way to expose what was happening, everything would be lost. His chance at freedom, the truth, everything. "Do you have anything on the people behind this?" the agent asked, his voice sharp. "Any names? Anything we can use?" The officer quickly opened the cluttered drawer of the desk, pulling out a folder filled with paperwork. He rifled through it, his hands shaking, until he found what he was looking for. "This is what I got," he said, sliding the folder across the desk. "There are a few names here, officers, detectives, even higher-ups in the department. But one of them keeps showing up again and again. Every time something goes wrong, every time a case gets buried, this name appears. Someone by the name of Captain Davis." The agent's eyes narrowed. Captain Davis. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He had to dig deeper. "Where can I find more about him?" he asked. The officer hesitated, glancing toward the door once more. "I don't know. But if he's behind this, he's got a network of people who will protect him. You can't just walk in and confront him. It'll be a death sentence." The agent's mind churned. He needed more information. He couldn't just wait around hoping someone would spill more details. This was bigger than any one person, and it would take everything he had to make sure the truth came to light. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Someone was approaching. The officer's eyes widened. "You need to go. Now." The agent's chest tightened. There wasn't much time left. The walls were closing in, and if he didn't act soon, it would all slip away. But where could he go? What could he do with the information he had? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but it felt like they were slipping through his fingers faster than he could catch them. In that moment, as the footsteps grew louder, the agent made a decision. He wasn't going down without a fight. He wouldn't let this be the end. This wasn't just about his freedom. It was about exposing a broken system, one that had betrayed everyone it was supposed to protect. With a sharp breath, he stood up, ready to face whatever came next. The climax was coming, and whether it was a victory or a defeat, he was ready to make his stand. The agent stepped away from the desk, his mind racing as the footsteps in the hallway grew louder. He knew that the officer was right. He didn't have much time. The door was closed, and the room was filled with a tense silence, but the sound of footsteps was unmistakable. Someone was coming, and it wasn't the officer. A cold sweat trickled down the agent's back. He had to make a decision fast. The door was still ajar, but just barely. He could hear muffled voices now. Someone was talking outside. The agent's instincts screamed that this was his moment. He had to move, but there were so many questions still hanging in the air. Captain Davis. Who was he really? Was he the one pulling the strings? What was this web of corruption, and how far did it stretch? Before he could even take a step, the door swung open with a sharp, unsettling creak. The agent's heart skipped a beat. But instead of an officer or someone from the precinct, it was the last person he had ever expected to see. The young officer from earlier, the one who had been his only ally, stood in the doorway. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear, and his hands trembled. "They know about you," the officer whispered urgently. "They're coming for you. They've got people on the inside. People who—" His voice faltered, and he glanced over his shoulder, clearly panicked. "They're not just going to arrest you. They want you gone, for good." The agent's pulse spiked. "What do you mean? Who's coming for me?" The officer stepped into the room and closed the door quickly, his eyes darting back toward the hallway. "They've been tracking you, watching your every move," he said, his voice low and strained. "And I never thought it would come to this, but I don't think I can help you anymore." The words hit the agent like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? You have to help me. You've seen what's going on here. This isn't just about me, it's about exposing the whole damn system. You can't just back out now." I know, the officer stammered. "But you don't understand. I didn't know what I was getting into. You think you've seen corruption, but you haven't seen what's really happening. The people I'm working with, they asterisk." He stopped himself, looking terrified, like even saying the words could cost him everything. The agent stepped forward, grabbing the officer's shoulders, forcing him to look into his eyes. "What are you talking about? Who are you working with? You can't just leave me hanging now." But just as the officer was about to speak, his eyes widened in sheer terror. Without warning, he shoved the agent back, almost knocking him off balance. "They're coming. They've already found us. We don't have time." Before the agent could even react, the door burst open once more. The officer's body went rigid, his face a mask of horror, as two men in plain clothes, men who the agent didn't recognize, stormed into the room. One of them was holding a gun. The other had a badge. "Get down," the officer shouted, panic rising in his voice. The agent barely had time to react before he was shoved to the floor, his body hitting the cold tile with a painful thud. The men were already moving, their eyes cold and hard, like they had done this 100 times before. The agent's heart raced as he tried to regain his bearings, his mind scrambling to process what was happening. The officer was shouting now, pleading with the men, but it was clear the situation had escalated beyond his control. The agent could feel the walls closing in once more, and the weight of it all crushed down on him. What had he just walked into? Everything that had seemed like a small injustice, a bad arrest, a corrupt cop, had spiraled into something much darker. "Get him," one of the men ordered, his voice low and commanding. "No, I swear, I'm on your side," the officer pleaded, desperation flooding his voice. "I tried to stop him, but you don't understand. He's trying to expose," but the man wasn't listening. In one swift movement, he raised his gun, aiming it straight at the officer. "Shut up," he snapped, cutting him off. The agent's eyes widened in shock, the scene unfolding before him like a nightmare. This wasn't just a cover-up. It wasn't just a corrupt precinct. There were higher stakes at play. The people behind this weren't just interested in silencing him. They were willing to kill anyone who got in their way. The officer froze, his hands raised in surrender, his eyes pleading. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know this was going to happen. I just wanted to do what was right." The agent's mind raced. This was bigger than Captain Davis. There were people in the highest positions, people willing to use any means necessary to keep their secrets safe. And they had no intention of letting either of them walk out of this room alive. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, the agent made a split-second decision. He lunged for the officer's gun, grabbing it out of his holster in one fluid motion. The agent wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. But right now, he didn't have a choice. This was survival. The gun felt strange in his hand, but there was no time to think. He fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the room. The man holding the gun staggered backward, a look of surprise on his face before he collapsed to the floor. The other man lunged toward the agent, but he was too slow. The agent had already rolled out of the way, ducking behind the desk for cover, heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the man's footsteps approaching, heavy, deliberate, the sound of someone who had been trained to fight. The agent's mind spun as he clutched the gun tightly, preparing for the next move. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. This was war now, nothing less than a fight to the death. In that moment, as the sound of footsteps grew closer and the tension reached its peak, the agent realized that the stakes had just been raised. The people behind this weren't just trying to silence him. They were willing to do anything to make sure the truth stayed buried. And now, with every shot fired, with every step taken, the agent knew that the only way to win this battle was to destroy everything they'd built, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had left. As the door slammed open again, this time with more force, the agent's pulse quickened. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The agent crouched behind the desk, heart racing, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. His breath was shallow, barely making a sound, as he kept his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the next move. The man who had been shot was lying on the floor, blood pooling around him, but the other figure, tall, imposing, and now furious, was still coming. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, but there was no mistaking the threat in them. The agent's fingers tightened around the gun's grip, his mind racing through his options. He knew that he couldn't just hide and wait for rescue. The stakes had already been raised too high. He had no idea who was behind this, who was really pulling the strings, but he knew one thing for certain. If he didn't make it out of this room, all of his efforts would be for nothing. The truth would stay buried, and all the work he'd put in to expose the corruption would be lost. "Where do you think you're going?" the man's voice called out, echoing in the small room. It was cold, almost mocking. The agent swallowed, forcing himself to breathe calmly despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He needed to think, to focus. He had trained for moments like this. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to face. The truth, the deeper layers of this conspiracy, was still so far beyond his reach, and now, it felt like it was slipping away faster than he could chase it. The man was getting closer now, just a few feet away from the desk. The agent took a deep breath, moving as quietly as he could, positioning himself on the floor, angling himself for the best shot. He had one chance, one opportunity to act before it was too late. But before he could make his move, a voice broke through the tense silence. It was the officer, his ally, now barely recognizable. His voice was strained, almost pleading. "Stop, please, just stop." The agent's mind spun. Why was he still talking to the man? The officer should have been making a run for it, helping the agent escape. But something was wrong. Something didn't feel right. The agent's instincts flared. He raised his gun slightly, aiming it at the man's silhouette, just in case he was about to make a move. But something still wasn't sitting right. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, and every passing second made him feel more and more desperate. Suddenly, the officer's voice rose, sharper this time, filled with an unsettling urgency. "You don't understand, he's one of them. He's part of the whole thing." The agent froze. His heart skipped a beat. What did he just say? Before he could process the words, the officer's hands shot up in a sign of surrender. "I didn't want it to be like this. I never thought I'd have to choose sides, but they've got too much on me. If I don't cooperate, if I don't help them, they'll kill me too. I never had a choice, okay?" The agent's grip on the gun loosened slightly. Was this really happening? The officer, the one person who had been his ally, the one person he thought he could trust, was now revealing that he was part of this twisted network of corruption? The man in the room chuckled darkly, his voice laced with smug satisfaction. "Told you," he said, stepping into full view now, his face shadowed but still recognizable. The agent's blood ran cold as he recognized the man standing before him. It was Captain Davis. The man the agent had been chasing all along. The man whose name had haunted him in every file, every clue, every bit of evidence. Captain Davis *, the very name the officer had mentioned earlier. The agent's mind was racing, spinning. Everything he had worked for, everything he thought he understood about this case, was now flipped upside down. The officer wasn't just a victim in this corrupt system. He was a part of it. And Captain Davis? He was the architect. The agent's hand tightened on the gun again. His pulse was pounding in his ears, and the truth of the situation was starting to settle in with a heavy weight. The fight had never just been about him. It was about everything that had been built on this foundation of lies, corruption, and power. And now he realized that no one was truly on his side. Not the officer. Not anyone in this room. Captain Davis took another step forward, his cold, calculating eyes locked on the agent. "I told you, you should have stayed out of this. You had no idea what you were up against. You thought you were playing a game, that you could beat the system. But you never understood, this system is built to last. You're just a small piece in a much bigger picture." The agent's mind spun as Davis's words sank in. This was bigger than one precinct, bigger than one department. This was a network that stretched far beyond anything he could have imagined. The officer who had been his ally was just another pawn in a game that spanned continents, manipulating not just local police but the very framework of power itself. The officer's eyes were wide with fear, his hands trembling as he looked between the agent and Davis. He knew that the walls were closing in on him now. There was no way out for either of them. He had betrayed the agent and sealed his own fate. "I didn't know," the officer repeated weakly, his voice breaking. "I didn't know it would go this far. I just wanted to survive." Davis's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Survival? You think you'll survive this? There's no escaping once you're this deep in. You're just another cog in the machine." The agent's head was spinning. The weight of the situation was nearly too much to bear. Captain Davis had orchestrated everything from the shadows, using every resource at his disposal to control not just the precinct but the entire network of law enforcement. And now, he was standing there, revealing just how deep the corruption went. But despite the crushing realization that his efforts might have been in vain, the agent refused to give up. The stakes had never been higher, and as much as he wanted to collapse from the overwhelming pressure, he knew that if he didn't fight now, everything he had done would be erased. The truth would stay buried, and the people behind this would continue to control everything. The agent's eyes narrowed. There was still one last thing he could do. One final chance to expose the truth. But he couldn't do it alone. And as Captain Davis took another step forward, preparing to deliver the final blow, the agent knew that he was at a crossroads. This was the point of no return. Every move, every decision, would determine whether the truth would ever see the light of day or be swallowed up by the darkness forever. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was about to get a lot more dangerous. The agent's grip tightened on the gun, his eyes locked on Captain Davis, who was closing in with a sinister, almost gleeful expression on his face. The walls of the small room seemed to close in around him, each breath feeling heavier than the last. There was no more room for negotiation, no more second chances. The time for talking was over. Davis took one more step forward, his voice low and confident. "You think you can stop this? You think exposing me will change anything? The system is too deep, too powerful. You've played your part, but now it's time to finish the game." The agent's mind was racing. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to take action, to do something before Davis got too close. He couldn't let him win. He had to expose the truth, to stop whatever Davis and his people were planning. He was too deep in now. There was no going back. In one swift motion, the agent jumped to his feet, spinning to face Davis. The gun was steady in his hands as he pointed it directly at the corrupt captain's chest. The officer, still standing helplessly in the corner, watched wide-eyed as the situation escalated. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the tension of what was about to unfold. For a moment, everything was still. Time itself seemed to stretch out, as though the world was holding its breath. The agent's heart pounded in his chest, his eyes locked on Davis's every movement. The captain's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Then, without warning, the agent pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, loud and deafening in the small room. Davis stumbled backward, his hand instinctively going to his chest, but it wasn't a fatal blow. The bullet had grazed him, just enough to send him reeling. His face twisted in pain, but his eyes never lost that cold, calculating glint. He wasn't finished yet. "You should have stayed out of this," Davis spat, wiping the blood from his wound. "Now look where you are. You've crossed a line you'll never be able to come back from." But the agent wasn't listening anymore. He didn't care about Davis's threats, or his smug words. He was beyond that point now. He had a job to do, and if it meant facing down the very system that had corrupted everything he knew, so be it. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about justice. Just as Davis was about to make his next move, the agent heard a noise behind him. The officer, still shaken, stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender. But there was something different in his expression now, something that seemed off. "I couldn't," the officer murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let it end like this." The agent's mind raced, but he didn't have time to process what was happening. Before he could react, the officer reached into his jacket and pulled out something shiny, a small device. The agent's eyes widened as he realized what it was. A detonator. The officer's face twisted in remorse. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to do this, but they made me." Everything clicked into place, and a wave of realization hit the agent like a freight train. The officer wasn't just a pawn in this game. He was part of it all along. But more than that, the officer had been the one to set everything in motion. The explosion, the chaos, everything had been orchestrated from the very beginning. And now, he was ready to pull the trigger. The agent's stomach churned with anger, betrayal, and confusion. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "You can't," but before he could stop him, the officer's thumb pressed down on the detonator. The room shook violently, and the sound of an explosion ripped through the building, rattling the walls and sending everything crashing to the ground. The agent's ears rang with the deafening noise, his body thrown backward from the blast, his vision blurred with smoke and debris. Everything went dark. When the agent's eyes fluttered open again, he was lying on the floor, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. The world around him was a blur of chaos, crumbling walls, overturned furniture, shattered glass. But amidst the destruction, the one thing he could focus on was the officer. The man who had been both his ally and his betrayer. The officer was slumped against the wall, a look of regret in his eyes as he coughed weakly. "I didn't want this," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in the agent's ears. "But I had no choice. They would have killed me, too. You had to understand?" The agent struggled to his feet, his body aching with every movement. His heart was still racing, his thoughts clouded by everything that had just happened. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed: the officer's betrayal, the explosion, the chaos that had unfolded in an instant. He had been so close to exposing the truth, so close to ending it all, only to have everything turn upside down. But as the dust settled and the room grew quieter, the agent knew one thing for sure: he wasn't finished yet. The officer's hand shook as he reached for something in his pocket. A small flash drive. He tossed it toward the agent, who caught it with trembling hands. "Everything," the officer whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had just done. "The files, the names, the connections, it's all on there. You can still expose them. You can still stop this." But the agent barely heard him. His mind was spinning, overwhelmed by the truth he had just uncovered. The network was far deeper, far more insidious than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just one man. It wasn't just Captain Davis. It was a network that stretched across cities, across states, and even nations. It had its hands in everything: law enforcement, politics, business, and it was bigger than anything he could have ever hoped to bring down. But now, with the flash drive in his hand, he had everything he needed. The names, the evidence, the proof that this corruption, this machine, had been working in the shadows for far too long. He didn't need to destroy the system from the inside. He didn't need to tear it all down brick by brick. He just needed to shine a light on it. Let the world see the truth. As the officer's eyes slowly closed, his body giving in to the weight of what had happened, the agent stood tall. He was battered, bloodied, and on the edge of exhaustion. But the one thing he knew for certain was that this fight wasn't over. He still had one final move to make. With the flash drive in hand, the agent turned toward the wreckage of the room, knowing that he had one chance left to make everything right. But even as he moved toward the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle, what was truly at stake, was yet to come. And whatever happened next, he would be ready. But the twist? It wasn't over. As the agent stepped into the hallway, a shadow moved across the floor, and for the briefest of moments, he wondered, had he really escaped? Or had this all been just another part of the game? The agent's pulse quickened as he moved cautiously through the wreckage, every step echoing in the eerie silence of the hallway. His mind raced, the weight of the flash drive heavy in his pocket. He knew that with this piece of evidence, everything could change. The truth could be exposed, the corrupt system could be brought to its knees. But even as he walked, the gnawing feeling that something was off never left him. There was a lingering sense that this wasn't over, that he had missed something crucial. His breath caught when a faint sound reached his ears, a soft shuffle, like footsteps moving through the debris. He froze, his body tensing, eyes darting to every corner of the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. His instincts screamed that he wasn't alone. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the corridor, moving with purpose. The agent's hand instinctively went to his side, his fingers brushing against the gun's grip. He couldn't let his guard down, not now. Not with everything on the line. As the figure stepped closer, the agent's eyes narrowed. It was a man, tall, wearing a dark suit, his face obscured by a mask. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he knew exactly what was going to happen next. "Who are you?" The agent's voice was low but firm, trying to keep control of the situation. The masked man stopped just out of reach, his cold, calculating eyes never leaving the agent. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence growing unbearable. Then, the man spoke, his voice smooth but laced with authority. "You're in over your head, agent," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "This was never just about you, or Davis, or even the officer. You're not the first to try and take us down. But trust me, you'll be the last." The agent's stomach twisted. Who is this guy? The words sent a chill down his spine. He could feel the walls closing in again, like every turn he made was leading him deeper into a trap. He wasn't just fighting a few bad apples anymore. This was something bigger, something far more dangerous. The masked man stepped forward, his presence almost suffocating. "You think exposing the files will do anything? You really think you can just walk away with that evidence and change the world?" The agent's grip tightened on his gun. His mind flashed back to the officer's last words, the flash drive, the names, the connections. He had to hold on to that hope. If he didn't, then everything would have been for nothing. "Who are you?" the agent asked again, more urgently now. "What do you want?" The man's eyes gleamed behind the mask. "What I want doesn't matter. But what you need to understand is that you're already too late. The machine is already in motion. You can't stop it. And you can't run from it. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the hall as the man pulled something from his coat. The agent's eyes widened when he realized what it was, a detonator. You really thought you could walk away with the truth? The man continued, his smirk barely visible behind the mask. No one walks away from this. No one. The agent's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced as he tried to calculate his next move. But the man's words, his confidence, left little room for doubt. This wasn't just some isolated conspiracy. This was a well-oiled machine, a system so deeply ingrained that it was practically unstoppable. You're not going to get away with this, the agent muttered, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The man laughed, the sound hollow and chilling. I already have. And just like that, the agent's world exploded into chaos. The first blast hit the building with a force so powerful that it knocked the agent off his feet. His ears rang as the floor beneath him cracked and split. Dust and debris filled the air, and he struggled to regain his footing, barely able to breathe as smoke billowed around him. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, nothing but the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. In the chaos, the agent stumbled, his hand still clutching the gun, his focus now on survival. The hallway was crumbling, walls collapsing in on themselves. He couldn't think, couldn't focus. All he could do was move, pushing through the thick cloud of smoke and the sounds of destruction. But then, he heard it again, the soft shuffle of footsteps. The masked man wasn't done. The agent's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the man. He had to find him, had to stop him before it was too late. But in the thick smoke, he could barely make out his surroundings. Every corner seemed like a potential trap, every shadow hiding an enemy. It wasn't until he stumbled into the next room that he saw it. The countdown, the timer on the bomb, the device that would end everything, this building, the evidence, the hope for any kind of justice. The truth would be buried forever. His heart sank as he rushed toward it. The timer read 5 seconds. No, he didn't have time. He couldn't reach it in time. It was too late. But then, through the haze, he saw a glint of light. A figure in the corner, silhouetted against the faint light that filtered through the smoke. It was the officer. The same officer who had betrayed him, who had set everything in motion, and who now seemed to be offering him one last chance. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled something out, another detonator. This time, it wasn't for a bomb. It was a remote trigger, connected to the device that could stop the countdown. The officer's eyes met the agent's, and for the first time, there was no fear. No betrayal. Just a resigned acceptance. I couldn't stop it, but you can. I've made my choice. The agent's heart pounded as he rushed toward the officer, taking the remote device from his trembling hand. His fingers hovered over the button, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness. With one final glance at the officer, he pressed the button. Silence. For a long moment, there was nothing but stillness. The bomb had been stopped. The agent collapsed against the wall, his body spent, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The truth was safe, for now. But the war was far from over. The machine that had nearly destroyed everything was still out there, its gears still turning, its influence still far-reaching. And as the agent walked away from the wreckage, the flash drive still tucked safely in his pocket, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The last twist? The officer had lied. The files, the connections, the names, weren't just on the flash drive. They were hidden in plain sight. The agent was now the last person to hold the key to taking down the entire system. And the stakes had never been higher. The agent stood in the quiet aftermath of the explosion, his body aching from the chaos that had unfolded. The building was a shell of its former self, its walls scarred by the blast, but for now, the danger had passed. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. His mind was flooded with questions, but the most pressing one remained. What now? The officer who had once been an ally was gone, his fate sealed by his own choices. The agent's thoughts flickered back to that final moment. The officer's desperate eyes, the heavy weight of the detonator, the look of finality when he handed over the remote trigger. The officer's remorse had been real, but it had come too late. Now, the agent was left to face the consequences, carrying both the burden of justice and the heavy responsibility of the truth. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket and stared at it for a long moment, the tiny device feeling like both his salvation and his curse. It held the secrets, the names, and the evidence of the corrupt network that had nearly torn everything apart. But even as he held it, he knew that revealing the truth wouldn't be easy. The system was vast, and its roots ran deep. The people behind it weren't going to simply let it crumble. The agent had a choice to make: go public with the information, expose the corrupt officials and businessmen, and risk his own life, or keep the evidence hidden, safe, and secure, and wait for the right moment to strike. Either way, his life had changed forever. He left the ruined building, stepping into the cold, crisp night air. The city around him was still, quiet for the first time in what felt like forever. It was as if the world had taken a collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The agent knew he wasn't the only one watching. Somewhere, people were paying attention, waiting for his next move. But even as he walked through the streets, his thoughts began to settle. He had fought hard, and for a moment, it felt like victory was within reach. He had stopped the immediate danger, prevented the explosion, and gotten the evidence that could bring everything crashing down. But the true battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The next day, he met with his contacts, people he trusted, a small network of allies who had been keeping tabs on the larger conspiracy. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls as they gathered around the table, discussing the next steps. He had been careful about who he trusted, and it had paid off. These were the people who had been working behind the scenes to uncover the corruption, the ones who had helped him when he was too deep in the shadows to see the light. They all sat in silence as he placed the flash drive on the table. The weight of what it represented hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of how much was at stake. "You did it," one of them finally spoke, breaking the silence. "You got it." The agent nodded, his mind still processing everything. The battle had been long and brutal, but there was a sense of finality now, a realization that the pieces were finally in place. "We've got the proof," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't over. We're just starting to uncover the full extent of what they've done. The names on this drive, the connections, they reach far beyond what we've seen so far. This is just the beginning." The room was quiet again, the weight of the truth sinking in. But there was a sense of resolve, a quiet determination in the eyes of everyone gathered. They knew the stakes, they knew the risks, but they also knew that without this fight, without bringing down the people responsible, the cycle of corruption would continue unchecked. For the next several weeks, the agent worked tirelessly, coordinating with his allies, strategizing their next move. The information on the flash drive was invaluable, but it wasn't enough to simply release it to the public. They needed to be strategic, to make sure the story broke in the right way, to ensure that the right people were held accountable. They had to protect themselves, cover their tracks, and make sure that once the truth came to light, it would be undeniable. As the agent pored over the files, the deeper he dug, the more he realized how far-reaching the corruption truly was. Every turn led to another connection, another player in the game, and the names on the list were like a map to the heart of a criminal empire that had existed for years. The scale of it was overwhelming, but he knew that exposing it was the only way forward. And when the day finally came, the day the story broke, everything changed. News outlets, social media, and underground networks exploded with the revelations. The people responsible for the corruption, the manipulation, the crimes that had remained hidden for far too long were now exposed for the world to see. It was a flood of information, a tidal wave that shook the very foundations of the system. The agent had known the risks, but he had never anticipated how quickly things would unravel. The media coverage was relentless, and the world couldn't look away. For the first time in a long time, the truth had a chance to be heard. And as the investigation deepened, more people came forward, more whistleblowers, more allies from the shadows. The power of a single act of courage, exposing the truth, risking everything, had sparked a movement, a wave of change that no one could have predicted. The agent, now a hero to some and a target to others, remained out of the public eye. He knew the danger wasn't over, that the people he had brought down wouldn't go quietly. But for now, he had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth. He had brought light to the darkness. And with that, the story of corruption, deceit, and betrayal began to unfold before the world. But as the agent walked away from the chaos, he knew this was just one chapter in a much bigger story. The fight for justice was far from over, and the world was still full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The question wasn't whether he had done enough. The question was, How far was he willing to go to finish what he had started? And with that, the agent disappeared into the shadows once more, ready to fight another day.